I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Martin Ford, futurist and author of multiple books on emerging technologies, including the New York Times best-selling Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. Martin has over 25 years of experience in computer design and software development and is the founder of a Silicon Valley-based software development firm. He holds a computer engineering degree from the University of Michigan and an MBA from UCLA. Martin has written on the future of technology in the New York Times, Fortune, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, the Financial Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, and the Guardian, and has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows, including NPR, CNBC, CNN, Fox Business, and PBS. So Martin, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you with me today, sir.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This topic is so compelling. It is moving so fast. It is making headlines on a daily basis. And you have been so far ahead of the curve on it. Today, we're talking about themes from your book, Rule of the Robots, How Artificial Intelligence Will Transform Everything, which you published in 2021 as a sequel to the best-selling Rise of the Robots from 2015. So let me start by asking, what prompted you to write that first book back in 2015, and how did your focus change for the second book?
Right. So I actually started thinking about these issues long before that, way back in 2008. And actually in 2009, I wrote my first book, which was a self-published book called The Lights in the Tunnel. And it was basically about the potential for technological unemployment if AI automated a lot of jobs. And the title of the book came from a kind of thought experiment I used, which involved imagining lights in a tunnel that sort of explored the implications of lots of jobs disappearing for the overall economy. And that book, did fairly well for a self-published book, and that led to the opportunity to write, a real published book, and that was Rise of the Robots in 2015. So I actually had given a lot of thought to it before I got to that first book. So I've been for a long time concerned about this issue, that it seems to be inevitable that artificial intelligence is going to be a technology that's really unlike anything that's come before in terms of its impact on human work. And so that's really a topic that I've explored a lot in all of my books.
Absolutely.
So obviously, since I first started writing about this, 16 years ago, things have changed a lot. And Rise of the Robots, which came out right between, that first book in 2009 and this latest book was kind of like partway through this process. In 2012, which was after I had written the first book, but before Rise of the Robots, the first attention to deep learning or neural networks really came into focus, right? And that's the point at which all these big tech companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon started to make this massive investment in this particular kind of artificial intelligence, right, called deep learning. And it's really that process that began around 2012, which is now culminated in what we see today with ChatGPT and all the progress that we've made. So that was sort of the beginning of it. So things have obviously changed dramatically since I wrote any of the books. In 2021, I followed up with Rule of the Robots, and that book partly was kind of an update on the question of job automation, but it also was a much more holistic look at AI and all of its implications on both sides of the ledger, in terms of its opportunities, which I think are extremely important, as well as the various risks that came attached to it. But even in 2021, when that book was published, that was just after the introduction of GPT-2, right, which is the underlying engine for ChatGPT. So things are just now progressing at a remarkable rate. And I think that we're really now at the point where people are kind of waking up and seeing the technology, and they're seeing that the kinds of concerns I was expressing back in 2009 are now really kind of coming into fruition. And I think it's, for one thing, becoming pretty clear to a lot of people that all kinds of white-collar, knowledge-based jobs are clearly going to be threatened by these technologies.
Yeah, I've been following these technologies for decades, and I bought into the Panglossian view of them, and I still believe that there is a tremendous amount of social good that can come from AI and, potentially AGI, the singularity, all of those things. But one of the things that I tended to ignore, and I think a lot of people did, was dire concerns about the economic consequences of future automation and artificial intelligence. So this is something, again, you were way ahead of the curve writing about this. It has been 10 years since Rise of the Robots, 4 years since Rule of the Robots. And so what has changed in the economy over the last couple of years? And are you seeing the negative consequences that you predicted begin to unfold or unfold in a larger way?
Right. So I think if you look on the technology side in terms of the progress we're seeing in AI, no doubt we're getting closer to the point where theoretically this is going to be a much bigger problem. Now, in terms of the actual economic data, it's more of a mixed bag. And obviously, we don't currently have mass unemployment. In fact, we have a historically low rate of unemployment. However, you have to delve a little bit deeper into those issues. The unemployment rate, the headline unemployment rate, really only counts people that are actively looking for a job. And it's really important to understand that. So if somebody is completely disenfranchised from the job market, they just say, forget it, I'm not going to even bother to look, then they don't get counted anymore in terms
Yeah.
of that headline unemployment rate. And it's really important to watch what's going on there. Now, one really, I think, striking number is if you look in particular at what's happened with what we would call prime working age men. In other words, this is men who are between the ages of 25 and 55. So in general, 25 is old enough so that you've probably finished schooling, including college and even graduate school, most likely. And 55 for most people is probably too young to retire. So it's people that really ought to be in the workforce. Now, if you go back to the 1960s, say, at that point, about 97% of that group of men, 25 to 55, were either actively working, they had a job, or they were actively looking for a job. So they were, basically we would say in the workforce, right? Today, that number is more like maybe 88 or 89%. So there's been almost a 10% decrease in the number of these, prime age men that are engaged in the workforce. And again, remember, these are not students because they're over age 25, and they're not traditional retirees because they're only up to 55. And the question is, where are they? They're not all independently wealthy, just living on the beach, that's for sure. And there actually have been some people that have, done some research into this. And one thing they've come across is that there is a very large fraction of young people in particular that are simply not in school and not working. And what are they doing? The evidence has shown that to a large degree, what they're doing is playing video games, right?
Okay.
So there is this fraction of our workforce that is kind of checked out. And of course, there's another component of men that are on disability, perhaps for a genuine disability, but oftentimes for what many people think are disabilities that have been kind of invented as a way to, going on to disability insurance is one of the few ways to actually access something like a guaranteed income, although it's very low. So you get a lot of people with ailments that are kind of hard to prove or disprove, that can go before basically a judge and claim that they're disabled. And we've seen a definite dramatic increase in a number of these individuals. So there are a lot of issues there, but definitely there are a lot of people that have basically just given up, and that number seems to be increasing. A few years ago, Larry Summers, who's a very famous economist, used to be the Treasury Secretary, said that he thought that by 2030, that 10 or so percent of men, prime age men that is now out of the workforce could increase to 25% or even a third of the workforce, right? So it could, increase dramatically in the future. So I think you definitely have to look at statistics like that to kind of understand what's going on. And then, of course, the other component of it is the general increase in inequality, the fact that certain people are doing very well, and many other people have been left behind.
Well, and so again, when talking about AI, I think a lot of people look at this and say this is out there in the future, right? But these are kind of cumulative effects that come from technologies. I'm going to jump around in my questions a little bit because some of the things that you were talking about in terms of widespread economic disruption and unemployment from this diverse collection of economies of scale, right? These are what corporations have been using to increase their scale, increase their efficiency, boost their supply chain efficiency, things like that. So in this context, I mean, could we think of Walmart's displacement of local businesses in the 90s or Amazon's impact on brick and mortar firms in the double aughts as the beginning of this series of events, and that this may get progressively worse as AI continues to improve that efficiency?
Right. I mean, I think that's a valid point. I mean, obviously it's a complex picture. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
kind of focused on automation and technology, but there are many things going on here. There is the rise of companies like Walmart and what before that, the big box stores that had economies of scale,
Yeah.
right? There's obviously globalization and offshoring. These are all trends that kind of fit together and I think have contributed to this. But I do think that in the future, it does tend to trend to more and more technology and fewer workers. One argument I've made in my books is that we see, for example, service offshoring, where a job could be moved to India, right, and done by a person.
Yeah.
But now what you're seeing, obviously, with a lot of those people are in countries like India or the Philippines, and they're doing call centers, they're doing software programming. I mean, both of those functions, answering customer questions in a call center and writing sort of mid-level, more routine computer code. These systems like ChatGPT are proving to be extraordinarily good at exactly that. So we can see that there's this migration where it begins first as offshoring, getting people that can do this work for cheaper, and then eventually that becomes full automation, at some point in the future. You also mentioned Amazon. I think there definitely is a trend there too, where what Amazon has done is has decimated a lot of retail stores, traditional retail stores
Yeah.
that, of course, had traditional jobs for people that worked in stores. A lot of those jobs have disappeared because the stores, the businesses are gone. But there have been then new jobs created in Amazon warehouses, right? So there's been this progression from
Okay.
working in a store, maybe a small store, serving customers, and that job disappears, but now maybe you can go and get a job in an Amazon warehouse. But you're going to see the same progression there because the robots used in those warehouses are rapidly getting much better. And by some accounts, they're already getting pretty close to matching human dexterity, right? Which is the thing that human dexterity, hand-eye coordination, spatial understanding are basically the reasons that an Amazon warehouse still has a lot of people working on it. It's because they've also got thousands of robots, but the robots are not yet able to match people in terms of that dexterity and visual spatial coordination and so forth. But the robots are getting closer and closer quite rapidly. So I do think 5 years from now, what you're going to see is that in one of these big distribution centers, there are probably going to be even more robots and fewer people.
Well, let me jump into the larger issue of AI safety because you're one of the many AI subject matter experts who are beginning to warn the public about concerns over AI safety that have been around for several years and are just now starting to make headlines. In the last couple of years, we've had a slew of key researchers leave the field. One of the latest was OpenAI safety researcher Stephen Adler, who recently departed in November of last year, and he left behind kind of this quote. He was pretty terrified by the pace of AI development these days. So that echoes something that I've heard. It is moving faster than people feel comfortable with. And I think the part that's scary is it's moving faster than experts, especially safety experts, feel comfortable with. Despite these warnings, the pace of development in AI seems to be accelerating. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it definitely has also taken me by surprise. I mean, and again, I've been thinking about this for 16 years, but even, back in 2021, at the time I published my most recent book, I would not have predicted that we would be at the stage we're at now, this soon. I thought, that was probably at a minimum a decade away or something before we would, I think we can say we've now got machines that, for all practical purposes, pass the Turing test, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, if the literal Turing test is that you talk to a machine and you can't tell it's a machine. In a literal sense, we may not have passed it, because I think now, you can tell you're talking to ChatGPT just because it's too knowledgeable is beyond what any human being could be. But in terms of its ability to converse, I think it's clearly at human level. So yes, it is surprising and it is concerning. Now, in terms of the risks that worry me, I put them into basically three categories. The first one is the one that we've been talking about, which is the economic impact, the impact on jobs. That's maybe a little bit of a separate issue. I don't know if that's what most people are talking about when they talk about AI safety. But then in the safety concerns, there are also two categories, I think. The first thing, and the thing that I worry about the most, are the things that we either are facing right now or definitely will face in, probably the next couple of years. And this mostly involves how malicious people might utilize artificial intelligence to do bad things. And maybe at the top of the list, there would be, for example, autonomous weapons, right? Where you've got fully autonomous drones that can attack people and so forth. But other categories as well, the impact on privacy, spying on people, intentional misinformation that could be used, on social media to deep fakes, where you're creating fabricated media that could, we've saw back in 2020 what a video can do in terms of its ability to basically cause mass unrest. So you can imagine, an adversary, an intelligence agency that was adverse to us creating, for example, a video, using AI that was designed to create social upheaval in the United States. I mean, that's probably getting very close to the point where that could be done now. So there are a lot of real risks there that involve people using these new capabilities from artificial intelligence basically to weaponize it, right, to harm us. And I do think that those are real concerns, and we need safeguards and regulations to, safeguard against that. And then the other category is the existential risk, right? The concern about superintelligence and the fact that, it's not going to be another human being using the AI against us. It's going to be the AI itself, right, which is going to essentially get out of our control and then be beyond our capability to halt it or to, control what it's doing. And that's where we get into the concerns about what's called the alignment problem, right, where a superintelligence of the future may not be aligned with what's good for us, what's good, and this is a very complex topic, because the way people always frame that, they often call it the value alignment problem. Like, they worry that AI won't be aligned with human values, is the way they would phrase it. But I mean, what does human values mean? Does that mean the values of the Chinese Communist Party? The values of the Taliban? I mean, it really depends on who. I mean, I think we really need to say openly that we would like AIs to be built with fundamentally Western values, right? To incorporate, our ideas about human rights and so forth. And that's why I do think there's a real trade-off here. On the one hand, yes, the progress is scary, and I can understand that there is therefore, a compulsion out there to say, let's slow things down, let's be careful. But the other side of this is that we just saw with DeepSeek, right, that China is very close in the rearview mirror, right? They are, almost at parity with us, and we do not want the Chinese to really take the lead in this and end up developing the superintelligence with, their interests built into that system, right? And then get a jump on us. So I do think it's really critical that we win that AI race. So it's a bit of a catch-22 there. We want to be careful, but at the same time, we can't afford to hold back. So I do think it's, at this point, given where we are today, the progress where that's already been made, it's pretty much got to be full steam ahead.
Yeah, and actually, I love it that you mentioned DeepSeek because that is the upset that is making headlines right now. China's DeepSeek AI reportedly cost only $6 million to develop. Users report that it censors content to align with Chinese party narratives. So there are two potential big concerns there. One of them is, does the low cost of development mean that we're going to see more AI models coming from a variety of places, right? I mean, the genie being way out of the proverbial bottle, just, AI just emerging in a grassroots way, I guess. And then I guess the other major concern is, does this built-in censorship sound an alarm in terms of freedom of speech and historical revisionism that may apply to all AI, not necessarily just Chinese authoritarianism?
Yeah, I definitely think that the emergence of DeepSeek suggests that AI is going to become far more commoditized and it will become more affordable. That doesn't mean that the leading edge companies like presumably OpenAI and Google and so forth won't have an advantage. They won't have a more powerful system, but we may see that the secondary players catch up very rapidly, and there's a constant kind of arms race going on. Now, it's also important to note, I don't think we know exactly what happened with DeepSeek, and what I've heard is that, first of all, the 6 million figure is probably not accurate. I have heard that the DeepSeek people did have tens of thousands of NVIDIA chips, including, I think, some leading edge ones before the export controls were put on those chips, right? They did get some of them ahead. Others may have been smuggled. Others were the ones that were downgraded slightly for the Chinese market, but are still very capable. So I think the idea that this whole thing was built for $6 million is not correct. The second thing is that I'm hearing now that it was probably built, kind of piggybacked on maybe OpenAI's system, and it was done. What it did is it extracted the information from OpenAI's system and then distilled it, and it did that obviously by violating the terms of service in a way that OpenAI would consider to be malicious. But I guess it is possible to do that using, for example, the API that they provide. And you can, for example, give huge numbers of queries to OpenAI's system and then get the answers and then use that data to distill that into a new model. And I guess that's something that's fairly commonly done. And a lot of people now believe that DeepSeek was probably doing that. So it wasn't something that, it certainly and absolutely is not something that was built for the ground up, for $6 million. So it's unclear exactly, how close they really are in terms of being able to build a leading edge system. But it definitely is a real concern. In terms of the censorship, yeah, I think that's a concern for all of the models. Obviously, it's in DeepSeek's case, the fact that it's, the Chinese Communist Party doing the censorship is concerning. However, they did release everything as open source, right? Which means that, at least in this particular case, since it's open source, other companies can take that source and modify it and strip out the censorship. You can ask about Tiananmen Square and so forth, which you can't do with the system that's running on the servers in China. But in general, censorship, to one degree or another, is going to be an issue. I mean, it's been an issue with Gemini from Google, right? I mean, you remember the Gemini was unable to, literally could not generate a photograph of a white person, right, at one point. And that's also another form of, I guess, what you would call progressive left-wing censorships, right? So that is a real problem with these systems, is that whoever's ideology it's going to be, built into that system. And that's why, we need to be aware of that. But definitely, we don't want the truly powerful system down the road, the super intelligence, the one that makes the breakthrough that maybe no one is ever able to catch up with. we don't want that coming out of China, right?
Yeah.
And because
Yeah.
once that happens, it's probably not going to be, almost certainly not going to be open source, right? Um, and if they have a system that's vastly more capable than what they have, and they've built into it, their values, their view of the world, not just censorship, but their entire system of which is basically authoritarianism, right? And a total lack of respect for human rights, into a super intelligence, that's not going to be a good scenario. So it's really important that we stay
Well,
ahead of them.
so let me go into that area then. Let's talk about the singularity. Ray Kurzweil predicted that today's AI will become tomorrow's AGI by 2029. There are other futurists who have pushed that forward and said they're expecting AGI potentially by 2027. So, but Kurzweil himself, I believe, is predicting 2029 for AGI and a technological singularity by 2045, and he has stubbornly stuck to his guns about that 2045 date. So what are your thoughts on his timeline? Does that still align with what we're seeing in terms of development?
I would say now the 2029 number is not unreasonable, and I in all honesty, I would not have said that 4 years ago when my book came out in 2021. At that point I did not, that was before ChatGPT, and at that point I really would have argued quite strongly that large language models, given what we had seen of them at that point, probably almost certainly did not represent the path to AGI. Now, there's still a real question about that, and you will find very smart people at the top of the field, people like Jan LeCun, for example, who will tell you that LLMs are not still, not the way we're going to get
Yeah.
there. Gary Marcus is another, pretty prominent person who argues that very strongly, and they may well be right, but I've seen enough to certainly be a lot less certain than I was 4 years ago. I think that the argument I would have made is that in order to achieve true intelligence, you probably need to be able to manipulate the world and experiment and get direct feedback from the world. That's how biological intelligence arose, right? In terms of evolution, I mean, animals became intelligent because it provided them, a fitness advantage, right? Which enabled them to catch food or evade food or in some way to be more fit. But it had to do with interacting with the real world, and that's how it developed. And so an LLM is really kind of like, if you ask the question, can you be intelligent without ever interacting with the real world, but just reading about it? Without ever actually being able to touch something or move something or experiment with something, but just simply by reading, could you become intelligent? And I would have argued against that, but we're definitely seeing evidence that maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe it is enough to get there. I mean, certainly it's possible that there's more than one path to intelligence, right? That
Yeah.
the path followed by biology, in evolution might be one way to get there, and maybe there's another completely different path which can get us to more or less the same point, or maybe even beyond that. So I think 2029 is reasonable. I mean, it may not happen, but it's certainly very possible. And as you said, some top people, I think it's the CEO of Anthropic said maybe 2027, right? So these are, people that know a lot more than I do, that's for sure. And they're, so you've got to respect that opinion, but there are also opinions on the other side. So in terms of
It's
AGI,
intriguing.
yeah, so in terms of Kurzweil's first prediction, AGI in 2029, I think it's very reasonable. The second prediction involving the singularity in 2045, I have to tell you that, speaking now of the technological singularity, what my understanding of that is that at some point we have super intelligence, right? So beyond AGI, something that's vastly smarter than any human being, and then that intelligence gets directed to innovation and scientific research across the board. So pretty much every field of scientific and technological endeavor sort of begins to accelerate, right? Because you see all this amazing progress everywhere. And the progress becomes almost incomprehensible. It's like the exponential curve, the part where it gets almost vertical, right?
The feedback loop.
And that's the
Yeah.
singularity, right? Where it's incomprehensible. It's impossible to see what's beyond that, except that people like Ray Kurzweil, definitely do make predictions about what lies beyond that. And one thing he says is that he sees human immortality in the future, right? That obviously, if we have all this progress, scientific advancement, medical advancement, it's gonna naturally live to all of us living forever, right? And I actually interviewed Ray Kurzweil for my book, which is a series of interviews called Architects of Intelligence, which I published in 2018. And so I asked him, I said, Ray, do you really think you're going to live forever? And he said, yes. He said, I've reached longevity escape velocity is what he called it, right? Meaning that you can live long enough so that you're still alive when the next big breakthrough happens, which in turn will allow you to live another 5 years longer or whatever. And then there'll be another breakthrough within that 5 years, and that keeps going on indefinitely, and unless you get hit by a bus, right? Okay, so I have to tell you that I'm quite skeptical of that whole idea of the singularity. And the main reason I'm skeptical is that if you look at what it takes to achieve all of this massive progress, intelligence is really only one input, right? And I would argue that in many cases, it's not necessarily even the limiting input, right? It's not necessarily where the bottleneck is. So to give, a concrete example, think of, this issue of longevity, which is, what a lot of, I think, people in Silicon Valley who are into this, singularians, as they call them, are very into. Imagine that you're a scientist. Imagine you're a Nobel Prize winning scientist doing research. How can you make people live longer? Okay. And your intelligence is a big part of it. And let's imagine that this super intelligent AI comes along and makes you vastly more intelligent. And now you can generate much better ideas and better hypothesis, right? Better theories of what to do. That's great. But you know what? You still have to do experiments, right? And if you're in the field of longevity, probably the first thing you're going to do is you're going to experiment on rats, right? And you've actually, whatever, no matter how brilliant your idea is, or maybe even the AI invents a drug for you and says, this drug will work, you need to give it to the rat and see if the rat is going to live longer, right? And rats, I think, live on average like 3 years, something like that, right? So you're not going to know until more than 3 years from now if the experiment even worked, right? And if in fact, and in fact, rats are not even that similar to people. If you want to go with, monkeys, which are a lot closer genetically, you could be talking about decades, right, before you know if it works or not. Now, I think in my interview, I sort of touched on this with Ray Kurzweil, and his answer is, oh, well, but there's going to be simulation of biological systems, right? I mean, now you think about what it would take to simulate an entire organism. I mean, something like a rat, or even, it would have to be simulated with very, very high fidelity, basically at the molecular, the biochemical level, right? Otherwise, I mean, you're going to do something like test a drug. You've got to have a simulation literally at the chemical level, right? I mean, I think that developing something like that, a simulation of an entire organism, is a hurdle beyond developing superintelligence. I think we're going to see superintelligence before you would see that. I mean, that's an incredible achievement to be able to do that. And then the question is, assuming, I guess the answer people would give is, but the superintelligence will create the simulation, of course. Okay, but how would you know the simulation works, right? How do you determine the fidelity of that simulation? I mean, we're going to reach a point where the FDA says, okay, you don't have to do a drug trial in thousands of people. You can now use the simulation. But how would you ever get to that point? I think it takes much, much longer than it's not just about intelligence. It's about actual time doing experiments, and seeing how the world, the universe responds. Now, some areas like physics, maybe you can do the experiments faster than you can in biology, where they would be clearly slow. Um, but in general, I think that there are many things that you need to have for progress, right?
Yeah.
You need to have investment money, you need to have time, you need to have intelligence, lots of things, right? So intelligence is just one of those things. So to assume that just supercharging the intelligence results in a singularity, I think is not at all clear to me. Um, Having said that, I absolutely do believe it will result in an across the board acceleration. I do think that the economist Tyler Cowen, for example, he wrote a book way back in 2011 called The Great Stagnation, where basically jet airliners fly at the same speed as they did in 1970, right? And cars haven't even changed that much. I mean, they're basically the same thing, except for many technologies have not really accelerated, and the same is true of things like antibiotics. And I do think we're absolutely going to see that acceleration across the board. But I don't expect it to be at the level of the singularity. But still, the impact of AI on science and technology, and the ability of it to sort of turbocharge that and increase is, I think, the single most important argument in favor of continuing to invest in artificial intelligence, even though it comes coupled with lots of risks.
Okay. Well, I have heard futurists compare the arrival of AI with the discovery of fire, which is one of our most used and valued technologies. But fire is incredibly dangerous when it gets out of control. And so I was wondering if there's a comparison there, but I also have this idea, I guess, that AI is reminiscent of plastics, artificial sweeteners, and GMO foods. I wanted to throw that in as well, because when those came out, they were preceded by excitement. They were launched into the market way too quickly, scared the public, and created a backlash. So, are we seeing kind of a mixture of both of those, where we have this incredibly powerful tool, but it's just being thrown out there, and maybe it's not ready for prime time yet, and that's scaring the public?
Well, I think there are elements of those analogies that are right. The analogy that I use is not to fire, but to electricity. And the reason I think AI
Okay.
is like electricity is that electricity is a systemic technology, right? It's what we call a general purpose technology. Electricity is everywhere. I mean, just imagine what your life would be like for one day if you had absolutely no access to electricity, right? If all the power went out and you didn't have any batteries, um, how our lives would change. And of course, that's why it's a genuine emergency when the power goes out, right? Because we absolutely
Yeah.
depend on it. It is systemic. It powers and intersects with virtually every aspect of our lives. And I think that that's what AI is becoming, and that's the comparison that I would make. I think that there may be some truth to your point about it being thrown out there very fast before people are prepared. But there's also another side, which is that it will take time for businesses and people and society as a whole to adapt to this, right? Which was the case with electricity. Um, it actually took, when electricity was first introduced and made available, it actually took a few decades before, businesses, factories figured out how to utilize this new resource in a way that really caused productivity to increase. And the same, I think, is going to be true with AI. That's why you're seeing we've got these really amazing demonstrations like ChatGPT, but we don't see so far AI impacting the overall productivity figures. I think the reason for that is that businesses haven't really figured out how to use it, right? And once they do, then we're going to see both an impact on jobs and presumably an impact on productivity. But there definitely also will be an increased impact on society and on individuals and so forth. And so you're right. In a sense, it's happening suddenly in a way that maybe people aren't quite prepared for, but you can expect that to continue to become bigger as, for example, the company that employs you figures out how to really utilize AI, then the impact on you is going to be even more dramatic, right? So I think that
Okay.
um, it's sort of like the toothpaste is out of the tube. I don't think there's any way we can stick it back in now. AI is out there. I think our ability to limit it or slow it down is probably misguided and frankly not possible anyway. So I think that we're really going to have to think on our feet, and that's why I think it's
Well,
incredibly important for people to be aware of these issues and be to really learn about AI, because it's going to be arguably it's going to be the single most important force that shapes the future, I think.
yeah, with any new technology, it seems like there is always a period of fear, uncertainty, and doubt as well, right? Like you mentioned electricity. I remember Tesla and Edison, if I remember correctly, Edison was running ads saying the electric chair is powered by AC, right? And so, you had all of these fears, many of them unfounded. Others were poorly founded, I guess, right? Where maybe there's some truth there, but it was overrepresented. We've seen that with, I mean, plastics, GMO foods, artificial sweeteners, electricity, nuclear energy would be a great example of that, right? I mean, the entire world just went crazy when the nuclear age started. And here we are, decades later, and we have a better understanding of how to harness it and use it in a socially productive way. So maybe AI will end up in the same place.
Perhaps, although the technologies are different. As I said, I think AI is much more systemic. I mean, you mentioned nuclear power, and I tend to agree that we made a huge mistake by turning away from nuclear power. I mean, it was the best green energy that we had. Yeah, I think it's crazy, for example, that um, Germany shut down all of its nuclear power plants in response to a tsunami and an earthquake in Japan, right? Which, I mean, just definitely a very panicked kind of irrational
Yeah.
response, which is now really damaged the German economy, right? And I think that's true of much of the world, that we really made a mistake there. But on the other hand, building a nuclear power plant is an endeavor that takes just massive investment, right? The barrier to doing that is extraordinarily high. Arguably almost as high as building a nuclear weapon, right? It's you're talking about resources and expertise, almost at the level of a nation state, right? In order to do that. Whereas what we've seen with uh, DeepSeek is that the barrier for entry with AI and these related technologies is going to be much, much lower. So, it's going to be much more distributed, open. Everyone's going to be playing around with it. People in their basement are going to be using AI in a way that they would not be building a nuclear power plant, right? And that creates both potential, opportunity, but also, danger in terms of just the fact that um, these technologies are just so much more accessible to everyone. There's so much more overlap between commercial and personal uses of AI and potential, military uses in areas like drones and things, which again is not the case with nuclear energy, right? There's a very bright line there.
Yeah.
So you've got very clear demarcation, and it's much easier to regulate, and just the resources required to get into nuclear energy in one way or another is just vastly beyond what it is for AI. The barrier to entry, the moat that keeps you out is just vastly lower in the case of AI. So I think that I wouldn't draw that comparison. I think, as I said, the toothpaste is kind of out of the tube, and we're gonna see how it unfolds.
Well, Martin, on that note, I want to thank you so much for your time today. It has truly been a pleasure, definitely an honor speaking with you. We've given people a lot to chew on, I think, and I think that these are issues that they will be thinking about more and more over the next few years as we move, deeper into AI territory. So let me close by asking what you anticipate seeing in the near future in terms of AI research, the next few months, if you're anticipating any big breakthroughs. And I also want to find out what your upcoming projects are. Are you working on any new books or revisions or anything like that to your existing books as technology progresses and things change?
Yeah, I'm definitely expecting, major announcements in the next, 6 months or a year, where everyone, is kind of holding their breath, waiting to see what OpenAI is going to do. And we're waiting for, ChatGPT version 5, which has not been released. But they did, of course, release this new reasoning model, which
Mm,
is based on the prior trained model. But now it's taking longer to think, and that's actually what this latest breakthrough with DeepSeek is also doing. So this is an entirely new approach. So I think in the future we're going to see one of two things: either we're going to see even larger models that are built with more training, perhaps at massive expense, and then on top of that we're going to see a lot more work with this reasoning that goes on at the inference level, meaning after you actually ask the question, it's thinking in order to produce a better result. So when you combine those two things, that's possibly the path to AGI, and we could be seeing that in the next year or so. So I think this is going to be just a terrifically exciting time in terms of the developments. And the thing that I think guarantees that is the competitive dynamic, right? You've got OpenAI, Anthropic, Google with Gemini,
yeah.
and now China, all competing, right? And I even skip some. I mean, X has got, Elon Musk has got one too, right? Which is,
Yeah,
I
he's
think,
got
less
Grok
less
and then,
less
yeah.
censored. So they're all going to be competing, and it, so that virtually guarantees that we're going to see just amazing progress. Um, so right now I'm watching this closely. I still do a lot of speaking engagements where I go out and talk about this. That's one thing that I really enjoy doing it, because it gives me a chance to meet a lot of people that are working in this field. So that's how I spend a lot of my time. One thing that I've actually done recently is, I mentioned my first book was The Lights in the Tunnel, which was written back in 2009. But I think that even though the technology that I specifically talk about in that book is obviously out of date, the book is really not about technology. It's about this thought experiment of what happens when automation eliminates a lot of jobs. And so, given that, what I've done is I've released that book just a few days ago, actually after DeepSeek came out, as a free download, because I think it's really, really important that people um, give a lot of thought to this issue, and to AI in general. And I hope that by releasing that as a free PDF that anyone can download and read, and it's not even a very long book, it's pretty short, so I hope it's pretty approachable. I'm hoping that if people, take a look at it, that will get them thinking, and maybe also get them involved in this conversation that I think we're going to have. So you can actually visit me either on Twitter or on my website. They're both mfordfuture, mfordfuture.com,
Okay.
or on Twitter at mfordfuture on Twitter, and you can find a link to download my free book there. And I hope people will take a look at it and really think about this issue, because I do think it's something that we're all going to be quite concerned about, maybe within just a few years.
Wonderful. Martin, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for having me.